The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Greetings from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and welcome to 1615's first webinar of 2013. I'm Matthew Ellison, the president of 1615 Church Missions Coaching. Today's topic is to send or not to send. Should the local church in America still be sending missionaries to the ends of the earth? In many cases, sending just a portion of our surplus, as little as $50 to $100 each month, will provide support for one full-time national worker. While the typical cost to send an American missionary family overseas is over $60,000 a year, and this cost continues to rise. This is the same cost as supporting 60 or more national workers. Just think of what that money could do for the kingdom of God. Admittedly, this rationale is appealing. Nationals have the language, and they know the culture, and they cost so much less. But what about the thousands of people groups around the world where there are no nationals, no witnessing churches? Nearly 2 billion souls live among people groups where there is no evangelizing church movement, often no witness of Christ at all. For these, by definition, someone must leave home to reach them. If a foreigner doesn't go in from the outside, they'll never hear the gospel. To send or not to send? This is the question we aim to address in today's webinar. We trust that this webinar will be helpful to you, your church, or your organization. Today's subject matter experts are Dr. Jack Elwood and Dave Hansen, both from Avant Ministries. Jack is the president of Avant Ministries, and Dave Hansen is the vice president of ministry relations. The mission of Avant is to glorify God by helping others enjoy His presence through planting and developing new churches in the unreached areas of the world. In just a moment, I will hand the microphone over to our presenters, but first a couple of details. Your phones are muted to preserve sound quality. You can listen through your computer speakers, or you can call in on the telephone. As questions come to mind throughout the webinar, please type them in the question and answer panel located on the right in the GoToWebinar task panel. We will be addressing these questions for the last 10 to 15 minutes of our time together. Nearly 70 people are registered for today's live webinar. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available for download at 1615.org and at avantministries.org in the next few weeks. Thank you, Jack and Dave, for sharing with us today. Let me turn it over to Dave Hansen.
Thank you, Matthew. In this next section, my goal is to kind of present to you the two sides. We're talking about, in this case, the use of Western money and only focusing on that part as far as where the resources are coming from. The goal is to try to give you what it looks like to support a national, and at the other side, what it looks like to support a North American missionary. So first of all, support of nationals. There's the case where it's church direct to national. There's the case where it is donor direct to national, or donor direct to agency to national. On the missionary side, there is the North American Sending Agency. Dollars per month. We all know that to support a national, it runs anywhere between $100 to $200 per month. At least those are the general statistics. For the North American missionary, we are talking about $2,000 to $6,000 per month. So you can see right away there's quite a big disparity between those two just as far as dollars are concerned. How about administrative costs on the support of a national? It's estimated, at least based upon the research I could do in looking at websites, someplace between 10 to 20%. Most of those costs, though, are hidden costs. In other words, they're not part of the $100 to $200 cost to have a national supported in a given country. On the agency side, administrative costs run today somewhere between 10 to 20%, and those costs are open costs or are on a support schedule and are open to anyone who wants to see what it costs to send a Western missionary. Willingness to suffer hardship. Usually we're talking about a national working in a village setting. On the North American missionary side, willing to suffer hardship, kind of a low percentage in comparison, primarily because we see more Western missionaries going to cities where the luxuries are just a little bit more. Ministry accountability. At least in my opinion, it's weak to very well organized if you have an organization. For the North American Mission Agency, Ministry Accountability, well, the donors demand it, and in most cases there's a board of directors, and they have their certain demands and controls and checks and balances of accountability. Pool of missionaries. For the supporting of a national, we're talking about the present people sending and receiving country being the same. In other words, the national is coming from his own country, and in most cases is also ministering in his own country, or at least very similar. The pool of missionaries for a North American mission agency, we see the western part as the sending country, where they minister for the support of a national within the same culture in most cases, or at least a very similar culture. Generally speaking, when you're talking about the support of nationals, you're talking about a poorer part of the world. It's not usually Europe, as an example, that we're talking about when we're talking about supporting of national missionaries. And in some cases, some believers, but not necessarily a large pool of believers. In the case of the Western missionary, any cross-cultural place, poor and rich countries, and even to where there are no believers, as Matthew made reference to in the beginning. Now the question of language. In most cases, for the support of a national, you have the same language or a very similar language, often used as the argument of why we should send nationals and not Western missionaries. In the case of a Western missionary, in most cases, I would say you're talking about a 1 to 2 year training period just for them to learn the language. Culture. In most cases, we also see the same culture or at least a similar culture. In the case of the Western missionary, most cases, again, it is totally different and can take 2 to 4 years just for that Western missionary to adapt. Let's look at political. The national missionary is seldom asked to leave the country because often it is his homeland. In reference to the Western missionary, under political, it is getting harder and harder to enter, and it is getting harder to stay long-term in many parts of the world. Looking at relationship to the sending church for the national. In most cases, at least from my perspective, it's probably very weak to none. In reference to a Western missionary, it is part of the process, and the North American Church wants ownership of the Western missionary. Church ownership of the Western missionary is growing every year, no matter the size of the church. Donor relationship to the national worker, weak to none. Many times it's just a picture. Donor relationship to the national worker for a Western missionary is usually quite strong. After all, they are expecting to receive emails, have blogs, letters every month, and in many cases, even a visit. National missionary impact on the local sending church. In most cases, I would say this is weak to none. Little growth, little giving. By supporting the national, the missionary is not teaching his home church, if he has one, to give and to send. For the Western missionary, under the same category, there's high motivation, there's passion, there's vision, there's ownership of the Great Commission. It causes growth in the church, and in most cases, it causes increase in giving. Move to self-supported. For the national missionary, this is weak to never. Unless he becomes a tent maker, he will always need the Western support. So that's why you have the discussion of high dependency. In reference to the Western missionary, it should be the goal of the Western missionary to allow the national church to be self-sufficient. It has become more and more of the focus of the Western missionary, particularly in the last 10 years. And there is very low dependency required. After all, it's all the Lord's money. The riches of the West should share with the poor. After all, it's all His. In reference to the Western missionary, if we didn't spend all the money on missions that we have within our churches, what would we spend it on? Maybe we would just build bigger churches. So you can see from this the two sides that we're talking about in this webinar. Now it's my privilege to turn it over to Dr. Jack Elwood. Jack?
Thanks, Dave. This is a challenging question, and we don't promise to provide absolute clarity to the answer in this and guarantee that you'll come away knowing the correct response, but we do guarantee you will leave confused at a higher and more significant level. So let me suggest a couple of things in trying to wrestle with this question. There are three dangers that I think we need to address when we try and deal with the complex and complicated. The first is the danger of false dichotomy. That is the either-or rather than the both-and response. It would be similar in answering this question to the tension we experience in the Great Commandment, to love the Lord our God and to love people. If someone asks you which one of those do you do, correct response would be both. Both must love God and love people. It's the similar tension you experience as a missionary on the field, which is more spiritual, meeting the physical needs of people or the spiritual needs of people. Reality is we have to do both. We've seen this in the most current Coke Zero ad, if you've seen that with Ken Jeong, who uses the expression, I'm done with or. Both and is what he says Coke Zero does, taste and 0 calories. In the same sense, when we wrestle with this question, it must be both and, not either or. The second danger is what I would identify as fiscal deception. It's what my Chinese pastor friend used to tell me, that when it comes to money, nobody's Christian. Money has a way of twisting our thinking. It comes out of our value system and often is very revealing as to what our priorities are. What Jesus talked about in Matthew 6 when he talked about our treasure revealing where our heart is truly there. And because our heart is complicated, even deceitful at times, we have to realize that sometimes our view of money is coming out of a deceitful heart. Secondly, when the Apostle Paul instructs us in 1 Corinthians 4:1 that stewards are to be faithful, we have to be careful how we interpret that. I don't think what he is saying is that we evaluate simply by a bang for the buck model, which is very popular in American culture. If so, we'd have a hard time explaining the value of the perfume that was placed on Jesus' feet. The disciples thought it was a waste. Jesus thought it was very significant as an act of worship. Secondly, I think sometimes when we try and associate the cheapest price with godliness, we find that doesn't always work. I would simply suggest for you who are husbands, ask your wife if the cheapest gift you can get her is received as the best. Often in my experience, it is not. The third component of that is in our dealing with stewardship of resources, we have to be careful because, as Timothy 6 says, the love of money is the very root of all evil. And I have found that many times our desire for stewardship is really a coloring of covetousness. That is, we desire money even when we're trying to be stewards because we're protecting it rather than simply being gracious in the way that God has provided for us to meet the needs of others. And I think when it comes to the sending component, we've seen a lot of fallout and feedback in the last year, especially in the political environment in the U.S., about the business concept of outsourcing. And if sending others to do the work of the ministry is simply done because it's cheaper, I think we're far closer to outsourcing of missions than we are to the biblical model of partnership with global brothers and sisters around the world. We have the danger of false dichotomy. We have the dangers of fiscal deception. And thirdly, I would call it the danger of fraternal dependence. I want you to know I had to work very hard to get that third alliteration. But this is the issue in our desire to help and to equip the global church, is for us to realize that often we come from a position of power. And the reality is, when we deal with others, we must be careful to apply the golden rule. And the golden rule is not he who has the gold makes the rules. It's treating others as you would have them treat you. And often when we minister to others who are in a lower socioeconomic class, or those who do not have access to all of the global resources that we do in the West, we forget what it feels like when people do things for us rather than helping us to do it ourselves. To paraphrase Fickard and Corbett's book, When Helping Hurts, sometimes our desires are right, but our actions are wrong. And I would suggest that when we are helping others financially, we must be careful to ask the question, is it creating dependency? Is it empowering people to care for themselves? And is it done in such a way that it does not demean people or reject their potential as men and women of faith? When that begins to happen, we have hurt rather than helped in the global cause. And lastly, I think one of the things that comes clearly through this process when we use our resources is that the goal must be clear to both parties. If we are indeed going to be engaged in sending others, we have to make sure that we are treating them as adults. Just as in the parenting process, when we are parenting our children, we are really seeking to raise adults. We do not desire for them to be immature children. We want them to share as full adults. In the same way, when my teenagers were there in my home, I would remind them that they will not be living at home for the rest of their life. I want them to move out. I want them to be independent. I want them to rise to the full stature of what God has called them to be. And oftentimes, in a very, very practical sense, from an agency side, I can tell you that as we have sought to establish the church around the globe, especially as national churches and associations have been built, many times, in order for them to reach their full maturity, we have to, like the eagles, pick the young out of the nest to help them stand on their own, not out of a lack of care or as an absence of love, but a true demonstration of our confidence and trust in them that the gospel has taken root, that the church has risen to a level of maturity, and that they now need to become partners as senders and not just receivers of the global task. So when we think of this question, this truly challenging question of to send or not to send, we can realize that it really should be both and. Paraphrase Shakespeare, to send or not to send, that is the question. Our answer should be yes.
Thanks, Jack. After 11 years on the mission field, I returned to the United States, where I became part of a ministry that had over 170 nationals working outside of North America. I also was part of a mega church that was very engaged in growing missionaries. Some years as many as 3 missionary couples would be commissioned in 1 year. At the same time, that mega church was engaged in also the support of national missionaries, particularly in India. I then joined a mission agency, obviously, Avant, and now I'm looking at this subject from the mission agency standpoint. And I'm sure by now you realize that this is somewhat of a complex subject because there are so many factors that have to be taken into consideration when we're discussing this. And we must realize that it is not just a discussion of money as many want to make it. How often have I heard the discussion of, wow, it costs too much to send a Western missionary. After all, I could save a lot of money by just supporting a national. You also have those on both sides who are very outspoken on their position. And my experience has been you have some of those who today, now 20 years later, are taking a less dramatic position than they maybe had a number of years ago. So I'm going to try to maybe make 3 applications, at least from my perspective, to this whole subject. The first application is about obedience. We must remind ourselves we are not talking about hiring people like you might do at Walmart. We are talking about people who are being directed by the Holy Spirit to go and take the message of Jesus Christ to the lost. Maybe in all of this, sometimes we lose sight of what is most important. A very important message being carried by very important people, whether they be national or Western. I remember a number of years ago coming home from the mission field and hearing this argument about should we give $50 to a national missionary, in this case working in India, or should we give, at that time, maybe $1,000 to a Western missionary going to some part of the world. I had the privilege of knowing Theodore Williams, who was the president of one of the largest mission agencies in India. And I remember sitting down with Theodore Williams and asking him the question, what about this whole deal of let's just support nationals? And Theodore Williams turned to me, and again, having over 900 national missionaries under his umbrella, turned to me and said, Dave, it's about obedience. It's not about which one is cheaper. Unfortunately, in this whole discussion about should we support a national versus the sending of a Western missionary, many times we make it about the financial cost instead of about being obedient. Are those who are serving, are they being obedient to what God has called them to do? And are we recognizing that step of obedience that must be challenged and guided by the Holy Spirit? The second application is that of a question, why not partnership? Why does it need to be them versus us? If you have never read the book by Daniel Ricketts, Building Strategic Relationships, it's been around for quite a few years, this book, and he has written some other books since that time. I would strongly encourage you to read this book because it has some wonderful, wonderful nuggets in it about working with nationals. For example, on page 17, he says, and his topic is healthy dependency, and to a certain degree, that is a subtitle that floats underneath this whole discussion about the support of nationals. Quote, therefore, it is important in a partnership to not only give, but to receive, to not only teach, but to learn, and not only to lead, but to follow. Then he goes on to say, they don't allow money to become the most highly valued resource. By that he's saying, in a partnership or the support of nationals, are we allowing the money to become the most valued resource, or are there other aspects of that relationship with a Westerner or Western church, whichever the case might be, in the support of nationals? And he's saying, don't allow money to take over. In his book, I Remember the Story, that we hear often, and the version that we hear often here in the West is, well, let's go overseas and we will teach our brothers how to fish. The problem with that story is that we have already concluded before we even go that they do not know how to fish. Daniel's emphasis would be, no, let's go fishing together. Let's sit down together and see whose method is working the best. Let's use whichever one works the best in order to accomplish, in this case, catching fish. So it is incredibly important that when we talk about the send or not the send or the support of a national, that we recognize that if we are supporting nationals, we need to see it in the context of not just money, but we need to see it in the context of true partnership and a true relationship between them and those of us who are involved in supporting them. There is an organization called Whitefields, and I'm going to use the term Whitefields model because to the best of my knowledge, they were one of the first and maybe the few who developed a model to where they would support a national on a 5-year plan with a 20% phase out each year. That is a wonderful plan to follow because it does answer that question of dependency. So each year you decrease the amount of support that you are giving to that national by 20% and hoping that the church that they are planting or the ministry that they are launching will absorb what you are decreasing as the Western support to their ministry. Now, I wish it were quite that simple, but it's not. For example, you could plant a church in a village in India, and that church could be planted by a national missionary who is only receiving $150 a month from the West. Yes, he may have, after 5 years, a gathering of 50, 70 believers in that village. But those 70 believers are not capable of even providing him half of that $150. So what do? Can he live on 1 egg? Can he live on 2 eggs? Which may be what they give in the offering. That's where it becomes necessary, and the church that I was part of in Nebraska that has been doing this, they found that they had to come in and teach those national missionaries how to also support themselves once they planted the church. Yes, they used the 5 years phase out, but it didn't work in that case because the economy of that village was so poor that even though you brought together a group of believers, maybe as many as 70, they couldn't even come close. But instead of the Western church continuing to just send its money, they now have spent a lot of resources of trying to provide that national missionary / pastor a way of local income. The third application would be that of Go Together. This is where today most of us realize that the Latin American church, the Korean church, and other parts of the world, the church has been growing for many years. Avant has been in Ecuador for over 100 years. 300 missionaries went to Ecuador in that period of time. The church has been planted and is growing in Ecuador. We closed it as an official country. In other words, we are not recruiting North American missionaries to go to Ecuador. But we see the Latin American church as a resource of going other places. We call that Go Together. Avant is now today putting together, for the first time after an existence of well over 100 years, its first team of what I'll call nationals and Western missionaries. In this case, we're talking about people from Brazil. So this team who will go to East Timor will be made up of nationals from Brazil who are supported by their churches in Brazil, joining 2 Western missionaries who are supported primarily by the Western Church. And that is a perfect model of how we can go together to reach unreached people groups around the world. It's national missionaries living in unity with North American missionaries, a true reflection of the body of Christ. So those are 3 applications that I've tried to take away from this whole discussion of to send or not to send. And again, both Jack and I would agree it's a very complex subject, and there are aspects that maybe we have not addressed today in a webinar that might influence how a question or how you would deal with the supportive nationals versus, and obviously we do away with that word, the Western missionary. So Matthew, that's kind of our presentation of to send or not to send. We'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Jack. I appreciate the emphasis on both and. I think one of the things that's been concerning to me over the years as I've been involved in missions is the groups that say we have the model, this is the silver bullet, we have figured it out. And it truly is a complex issue, and I think both and is a good answer. And I think the watchword is think. Do this carefully. Think through it, pray through it, and do it in a way that empowers people. I want to turn it over to the attendees at this point, the registrants, to ask questions to Jack or Dave or myself, primarily them. They did the presentation today. We have a couple on here already. Give me a second here, Jack and Dave, and I'm going to filter these questions to you. We are looking at comparisons of national missionaries with Western missionaries. Is this apples to apples? The national missionary that is being described as not a missionary but a pastor, does that change things? Would you like me to re-ask that question? Here we go.
Well, I think.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, whether we're talking truly about sending, in the technical sense of the word, a missionary who is crossing cultural or linguistic barriers to go plant a new church among people who don't have one, whether they're pastoring a church in their own language and in their own culture. That's even more complicated, if you will, than the deployment of a national to either a close-in people group or one who's further distant. So I do think you have to clarify what it is you're talking about. I think the principles that we've mentioned previously are still true, but those are, it's not apples to apples if you're using that definition on both of them. So I think clarity has to be brought about in terms of who you're talking about. For example, from our perspective as an agency, we would not send a Western missionary to pastor a national church. So we are comparing those differently in the sense of one who is going to establish a church that doesn't yet exist. Dave, do you have a thought on that?
Well, I know that in the case of my church from Nebraska, their original goal in the support of nationals was that they would go into a village and plant a church, and then they would leave. But that mindset of, I went to that village and I planted this church and I saw 70 people come to Christ and I moved my family there, they just couldn't handle not staying there as the pastor of that church. It was a mountain that seemingly they couldn't climb or they couldn't handle that change. So that question is very, very valid, that in most cases, if you're talking about a national going into a village that's unreached and he plants a church, I would say, unless I'm missing something, in most cases they do stay there as the pastor, and that is a little bit of difference compared to the Western missionary. I would say, though, that in those early years when they went to that village, that national who went there and there were not believers, and that Westerner who went into a place that there were not believers, those early years, there probably were closer to apples. The difference, as Jack said, at least definitely in these last years, the Western Mission Agency has definitely put a strong focus on you're a missionary, not a pastor or permanent fixture. I think early years of missions, though, from the West, we would have had apples to apples because a lot of missionaries became permanent fixtures in whatever country you're talking about, and they took on a role similar to a pastor in one form or another. And that's why they ended up being there for 50 years instead of 20 or whatever the case may be. So that's a very valid discussion and a very valid point, and appreciate that question.
Here's another question that's a little bit similar, slightly different. Is it theologically accurate to compare supporting national pastors and missionaries? Aren't they different gifts and roles in the kingdom? The role of a pastor in the New Testament seems to be a focus on people already in the church, where a missionary/evangelist is on the lost.
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure it's theological in the sense of it's definitional. There is a difference between the role of an evangelist and the role of a pastor. And from a technical viewpoint, again, when we define missions as the taking of the gospel across cultural and linguistic barriers, to differentiate it from evangelism in terms of within our own culture or language, there is a distinction. I think the challenge comes in terms of how the local church, again, grows and takes care of its own, and how the gospel goes to people who have never heard. Paul, the apostle, was very clear that he did not want to take money from people that he was preaching the gospel to, in the sense of he didn't want to look like he was selling the gospel, but he was unapologetic in asking the church to support the work of the gospel going forward. And so I think there's a healthy balance there when you clarify those distinctions of how the church is going to fund its growth and outreach of the gospel to the nations.
Matthew, go ahead. I really have nothing else. I don't know what else to comment. That's pretty clear, I think.
Dave, would you repeat the book title from Daniel Rickett?
Yep.
Building
Strategic Relationships, a practical guide to partnering with non-Western missions.
One more time.
Building Strategic Relationships, a practical guide to partnering with non-Western missions, Daniel Rickett, R-I-C-K-E-T-T. And if you saw my
Go ahead, Dave.
I was going to say, if you saw my copy of it, and this was particularly during the years in which I was working with 177 nationals around the world, I have it marked up all over the place. It's a great book of giving some wonderful guidance of how to work together. It was, I guess, published by, well, he was with Partners International at that time.
Yeah, I want to heartily recommend that book. It's an excellent read for anyone who's doing cross-cultural ministry and is interested in strengthening their partnerships. Let's see. One comment here is not a question. I like it. We already know how to fish. We just happen to do it differently, and in many cases, we've been fishing longer. Here's another question. Before we send a missionary, shouldn't we ask the national leaders in that community if they even want a Western missionary?
I would say that's true, and that's assuming that you are sending a Western missionary to where there is a national church. Okay? So if we are talking about sending a Western missionary where the church doesn't exist, who would you ask? And in that scenario, I would say maybe at least outside of that community, depends on the country you're dealing with. I think it is very, very important to get input from, if there are believers either in that country or near that country who have wonderful advice that they can give to us. But based upon the way the question was read there, you seem to be assuming that the Western missionary is going where there are believers. I think today's world, the Western Mission Agency is definitely focusing more and more and more to trying to send Western missionaries where the church doesn't exist. And that's why Avant, for example, no longer recruits missionaries for Ecuador as an example. We do not feel that we need to send a Western missionary to Ecuador to plant a church. That doesn't mean the whole country is totally evangelized. That doesn't mean there are not other things that the Western mission could do to help the Church of Ecuador. But if you are talking about planting a church, why would we need to send a Western missionary to a place like Ecuador?
The other thing I think I would just comment into that discussion, Matt, is an understanding, too, of the complexity of cross-cultural life. For example, in many countries of the world where you have a persecuted Christian minority, let's say, for example, in an Islamic country, and you say, well, we'd like to reach Muslims for Christ, I've had national believers say, why do we want to do that? Because they have such difficulty understanding in light of their persecution, in light of their oppression, that even though they are Christ followers and they know theologically God wants all people to come to faith, it is hard for them culturally, emotionally to understand what it might take to reach Muslims in that setting. So while we are not known from the West for being sensitive to cultural issues, and we need to be, we do have to understand, too, that many times a national church is not always the best partner in reaching the unreached or even close cultural neighbors to them. Sometimes it's actually a benefit to be an outsider in reaching a people group that exists in that type of a complex setting.
That's a great point, Jack. I want to key off that quickly. Obviously, if an agency is looking at a part of the world, the first thing they're going to want to do is to look to find out, are there near-reach peoples? Who's already working there? Are there national believers, if you will, national Christ followers? But to your point, oftentimes those national believers are the worst people you would send to a neighboring culture because of the ethnic strife that exists. So again, this is not a one-size-fits-all. Every situation merits investigation. In some cases, a near-reach people might be ideal. In some places, it would be the worst group to send. Here's another question. This is an interesting one. In supporting nationals in India, we have a lack of accountability structures such as financial, strategic, and spiritual due to language and cultural barriers. With our North American missionaries, we are able to put those checks and balances in place. Any ideas on how to gain confidence in helping provide accountability to our national pastors?
Well, I think this is the one benefit oftentimes that agencies can provide to local churches who are on the ground in those situations or have field experience or knowledge of the situation, that many times without a strategic partner on the ground, it's impossible for a Western church or agency to really know what's going on. It does speak to the issue of trust. And I think when you have trusted relationships, you have much greater leverage in this area of having confidence that resources will be used wisely. It's often what I call the danger of the Pentagon issue, and that is the worst thing you can do sometimes is throw money at a problem. And so if you throw money at it hoping it's going to go away, you really haven't solved anything. You've got to be able to build relationships that enable you to know how resources are going to be used.
And I think that's why we talked about partnership, because it's so much more than just about the money. that question is somewhat assuming or implying that really most of the relationship is money versus a true partnership. And trust is exactly that. I'm reminded of the time that I was asked the question about radio broadcasts that are being done by nationals, in this case around the world, in which they are not translating Western content. They are writing and producing their own content and airing that broadcast. The question I was asked was, don't you back translate all those programs and make sure you know what they're saying? And I turned to that person and said, does anybody know what your pastor is going to say before he preaches from the pulpit on Sunday morning? No, it is about making sure you have the right person and showing trust and confidence in that person and his ability to deliver, in this case, the Word of God. And again, I think that comes back to it's way more than about money. We are talking about knowing each other, dialoguing with each other, praying with each other, making sure that we are together spiritually walking forward.
I want to add to that. Robertson McQuilkin used to give a pocket guide on how to determine whether or not to support national workers, and I wish I remembered all of them. But just a couple that stood out in my mind is he said, be very careful when giving to the individual national worker. That makes a lot of sense, obviously, but some people are just quick to give resources to a person, a personal bank account. It's a simple accountability piece, but if you're going to give resources, it should be to an organization or a church as opposed to an individual. Again, a simple thing, but often overlooked. Just the temptations giving to an individual are really unhealthy. And then also, he discouraged giving to ongoing salaries. This was already mentioned earlier. If there is some salary supplement, it should have a clear exit strategy in place. So just two maybe accountability measures, giving to organizations as opposed to individuals, and then not giving to ongoing salary needs that frankly should be met by the local church. Even the term national missionary is a little disconcerting for me. It's a national worker. In most cases, they're not crossing a culture. It's a national worker. So being careful about giving so that you don't create dependency. Here's another great question. We're going to do a couple more, and then we're going to wrap it up today. How important is cultural competency in preparing to send people to witness abroad?
Great question. Obviously, the answer is very important. You know, that's one of the challenges that we have coming from the West, often knowing how to culturally interpret, not just language, but culture. That's very significant. And again, back to our question as it relates to Western versus non-Western, many times, you know, our global brothers and sisters are far more astute, far more able, transition those, but sometimes they're not. And so it really depends on who you're talking about, what are the people involved, how can you learn those cultural skills that enable you to do that. And I think that's the challenge, is it's really often a person-by-person, case-by-case situation in terms of questions should not be Western versus non-Western. The question ought to be, who's best at doing this?
Now I'll open really a big bag of worms, and that's probably the weak part of sending Western missionaries, if you want to use that term, on short-term mission trips to where they're only in that given country for a very short period of time. They don't have time to learn the language, and they don't have time to learn the culture, and yet we are investing resources and calling them, quote, Western missionaries. So if you were trying to talk about the support of a national pastor or national worker in comparison to that, boy, the scale would tip really fast, at least for me, if you were trying to make those two comparisons. So, you know, and when we were trying to show at the very beginning, obviously that is an area, a clear area, that language and culture, that national generally, is ahead of that Western missionary because it takes them X number of years in order to just handle those two aspects, and crucial aspects.
Let me give you a very practical illustration, though. Sometimes it can work in the reverse as well. I was a missionary in the Chinese world for about 14 years, and in discussing with some Chinese house church leaders about their vision, many of you have heard of the Back to Jerusalem movement. Their goal is to take the gospel as it has moved from the Middle East to Europe to the Americas to Asia, is to now complete the cycle, so to speak, in taking the gospel geographically back to Jerusalem, which is primarily through the Islamic world. And they're very committed, very zealous in this process. But as I was talking with them, I said, you know, we've learned some lessons in the last 200 years in the Western world about sending missionaries, i.e. the fact that Islamic world is not jumping up and down for North Americans to come to their country, but neither are they all that excited about the Chinese either. And so if we could share some of the lessons we've learned and help the Chinese prepare to be effective in the Islamic world, they have the courage, they have the faith, they have the boldness to make Christ known, but oftentimes don't have the benefits that we've had from the West of learning from our mistakes and learning how to engage people from the Islamic background in presenting Christ in a way that enables them to fully understand the gospel. And so that would be a good example of both the West and the East working together to take the gospel into an area that is a very difficult situation.
The next question actually hits on some of that, Jack, and I wish I had time to answer all of the questions. Jack and Dave answer all of them. There's so many good ones, but I'm going to make this the last one. We're going to have some concluding comments and then let you know what's coming up in the ahead. This is an excellent question. Would you ever support a non-North American missionary going to a closed country? Example, supporting an East Asian missionary going to Central Asia. How would you set up accountability for that?
Since that question is so easy, I'm going to let Dave answer that one.
How would you set up accountability? I guess, obviously, first of all, you would be talking about, do you know who that person is? What kind of relationship do you have? Do you have a track record? It has some similarities. The people that are going to be on our Go Together team are coming out of many years of relationship and ministry with the Brazil church, with those people and other people in leadership in those churches. So you have a very strong relationship as far as who they are. I think obviously we would probably always say our first choice would be that the home country, if I can use that term, be in the driver's seat as far as the financial resources. If that's impossible for one reason or another, which I'm guessing that this question is trying to allude to, I would not see a real problem with a Western agency being involved with the support or care and all the other aspects of that national going. Accountability becomes a real question, and that's probably where we would say we would not send them alone. And so we would want a team of some form going versus, I'm going to say, an individual or just a couple doing that all by themselves. And we would probably take some, I guess, comfort in knowing that there is more than one person or unit of missionaries working together. That gives you a little bit more of checks and balances of what is going on, both from a money standpoint and even from a ministry standpoint with the national in this case.
The reality is, too, in the 21st century, that's probably going to be a bivocational model. As we go more and more into restricted or closed countries, we're having to find ways of people using their vocational skills to even gain access, much less have ministry opportunities. So that even creates another level of complexity when people with either professional or vocational skills are going to be a part of a team that's engaged in church planting. is they've got to be able to have that background and resource to be able to be engaged in ministry.
There's another question that I can't resist, gentlemen. We've got a great attendee, a group of attendees online, and actually it's been consistent. So clearly the audience is interested in the topic. So here we go. Hold on to your seats.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on nationals coming to the U.S. to directly appeal to churches and Christians for support?
Wow, that's a great question. Are there any other great questions that you have?
Which ones don't?
Yeah. I could say out of personal experience, we have a few who've done that. And many times they are very persuasive and have a great influence on the Western church. They're seen as national believers. I'm thinking particularly Muslim background believers who come to faith and gives the church great hope and great vision for the world. It's very hard these days to gain access to churches, though, even for Western missionaries, much less foreigners. But I think when they can and when they do, it can actually be a great help, but it's a great challenge.
And I think that's where, on the church side, if you're talking about that, before you opened that door or gave them access to your church, make sure you know who they are, what their ministry has been. Is there a track record, or have they just shown up, so to speak? Because we do become somewhat, we like the accent, we like a lot of aspects of that national, and our body of believers open up their pocketbook and give, and in some cases they may even say, look what you can do for $150 or whatever the case may be. So I think that's where the church who is allowing a national to come here to gain resources needs to do its homework before it opens that door.
Excellent advice, Dave and Jack, as well. I think what I'm hearing is, is their model culturally reproducible? One of the challenges that I've come into when you have national workers coming to the U.S. to raise money, they're raising money for a model of ministry and church planting that's not culturally reproducible. So what they're communicating essentially to the pastors and leaders they're training up in country is that in order to have an effective ministry, you're also one day going to have to travel to the U.S. to raise money to support your endeavors. I ran into this in Central America with the church that we did a survey to the field, and they showed us their Bible college and everything going on, and it was wonderful. And I asked the senior pastor how much of the support currently is coming from the U.S., and he said a great deal of it. And I said, offline to the person I was surveying with from the U.S., he is unwittingly communicating to all of his pastoral trainees that they're going to have to go to the U.S. if they want a ministry as effective as his. So excellent word. Is it culturally reproducible? What's their track record in history? And then also on that, is it a replacement model? That's one of my struggles with the national message coming to the U.S. is, again, bang for buck, you don't need to go, we'll take care of it, which of course creates anonymity.
Yeah, on page 66 of Daniel's, in page 66 of Daniel's book, it says, in the end, your goal is to enable the ministry so well that they are capable of growth without your assistance. So if that's your goal and you can head towards that,
excellent.
Power to you.
Excellent. Well, folks, what a blessing it's been to serve you today in this way. Let me conclude here with some thoughts and let you know about some future webinars. Again, let me ask the question, to send or not to send? Do we send money or people? Well, until the task of proclaiming the gospel to every nation, tribe, and tongue is completed, I believe we send people. And we keep on sending them to cross the foreign frontiers. And we send money to assist the poor and disenfranchised in our worldwide family. If we are going to support the ministry of other churches on the mission field, we must not do this as a replacement to sending our own sons and daughters. And we must be careful to share financial resources in a way that is spiritually empowering and Great Commission completing. Here's a quote from Robertson McQuilkin that sums up this webinar pretty well. It's not just that North American missionaries are still needed to complete the task, however. The North American church needs to send its own for the sake of itself, its own spiritual health. The sin of disobedience to the heavenly vision can't be atoned for with dollars,
and the spiritual loss is highly visible in a self-centered, materialistically minded people. The original mandate has never been rescinded. The Pauline role of pioneering is still the primary mission of the church toward the world. Biblically, no church anywhere can claim exemption from the mandate until every person has heard with understanding the way to life in Christ, and a church has been established in every community. So let me let you know about our next webinar. Also a bit of a controversial topic here. Do local churches really need mission agencies? It will be presented by Avant and 1615. There's the date. You can register online, 1615, and also at avantministries.org. We hope you'll attend that. We have several other webinars coming up this year with Pioneers and a few others, but this is the next one on the list. And then the annual CAN conference presented by Avant Ministries in 1615 is in Kansas City again this year. Dave, why don't you touch a little bit on that, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sure. The CAN conference started a little over 4 years ago. It stands for Church Agency Now. The church and the agency need to come together in order to accomplish the task. We host it here on campus. We have motel-like rooms, great facilities. It's a day and a half. You can register at avantministries.org. Great food, great fellowship, and just sharing openly with each other, and it is totally free. And this year, on the first evening, we will have one of our own who has done his doctorate in reference to the authenticity of the Quran. So if that's of interest to you, you might want to be here to hear Dr. Keith Small. So we would love to host you on our campus right here in Kansas City, totally free.
And let me mention, the food is stellar. It is incredible food. So if you want some good fellowship and you want to be well fed and build some new relationships, I hope you'll be there. In closing here, there's some contact information if you want to know more about 1615 Church Missions Coaching or Avant Ministries. We'll leave that slide up for a little bit, but those are the main contacts to gather more information. Let me remind all of you that this webinar has been recorded, and it's going to be available at 1615.org and at avantministries.org within the next 2 weeks. Thank you once again to our presenters for sharing with us today. I'm Matthew Ellison for 1615. Thanks for listening.